Shon Faye, so nice to see you. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me, Sophie.
Well, thanks for coming to talk to me today. Brilliant. You are a writer, journalist, comedian, campaigner, role model. I mean, the list goes on and on. And also, of course, you worked with Stonewall Cymru and were a stakeholder with the Welsh Gender Service, which we've really enjoyed you being part of. So we consider you one of our own. And it's really special to have you talking to us today, a little bit about some of the things that you've been doing, but also sharing some of your experiences so that people watching can take some strength and power and inspiration from it. And of course, this is the perfect time to talk to you because you've got a book that is due to be coming out really, really soon, which is hotly anticipated. And I'm going to get myself right there, right at the top of the queue to get one. It's called The Transgender Issue, An Argument for Justice, which is a really powerful topic. And I love it. I love the title. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And it is described as starting a new, healthier conversation about trans life, which of course we could all do with. It's really much, much needed. But I actually imagine it probably goes further than that. And I know that you're so keen to pave a path to trans liberation. And I suppose what I mean by that is freedom from stigma and discrimination and all of those things that manifest as poverty, essentially. And I'd love, if you can, to share some of the key messages for this audience in terms of what they might be able to distill from this brilliant book.
Yeah, so the central argument of the book really is that, I mean, like there's a few sort of strands to it. Firstly, that that there's been a sort of ongoing conversation for a long time, really going back almost a century about gender variance in society and trans people, and in Britain particularly, but very rarely do trans people have a stake in that discussion. It's often a conversation conducted above trans people's heads. Sometimes at institutional level, and sometimes in the medical profession, sometimes in the law, sometimes in parliament, and sometimes in the media. And so the argument of this conversation is actually the discussion that's often taking place about trans people isn't about trans people, it's about cisgender people's anxieties and nothing to do with the material aspects of our lives and what we care about and what our priorities are. So I'm sure, like a lot of people watching this would know, that in the last few years in Britain, some of the discussion that's, the focus points of, there's been a lot of anti-trans content in the media, but it's not just that it's transphobic, it's that often what it's talking about isn't even what our priorities are. Like most people are most concerned about healthcare and when they're going to get their healthcare, or, waiting times, or access to healthcare and justice in healthcare settings. All they're worried about, if you're a parent of trans young people, about whether or not your child's being bullied at school, or basically whether you can get a job. These sort of like core things that we need to live is what actually most trans people care about. Yet what seems to be going on in the conversation, in the media, is stuff, more abstract things about like language, what terminology we use, what is sex, what is gender, these very conceptual debates that actually I don't think are the key issues that most people care about or their priorities. So this book tries to address those core priorities about trying to, it's aimed at a cis audience as well, is actually these are the key issues that face trans people in our real lived lives. So right from cradle to grave, basically.
Yeah, and you've given some really practical advice in the past, or explained elements of the Gender Recognition Act and elements of kind of, to a cisgender audience, namely. But of course, these are practical things that trans people actually pertain to trans people, enabling them to live their lives just as anyone else would, fundamentally. And I think there's still a lot of questions that people have about, how do I change my name? How do I, is this discrimination? I don't know, I'm not sure. And people actually not having an awareness of their rights, something that we all otherwise take completely for granted, but which of course so many trans people experience difficulties with. And I wonder if you've got some of that practical advice that you can share for people watching this.
Yeah, so I think, there are two things, because I think what happens is that probably especially if you're in online spaces, there's discussions amongst trans people are often discussing quite rightly, and it's something that I look at too, is where the system kind of fails us, or where there's institutional discrimination, or where things are unnecessarily difficult. And that's really important to have like a critique of that and to be aware of that politically. The flip side to it, though, sometimes I think is it can make particularly online spaces quite pessimistic, and it often doesn't give people the practical skills. So you know, I'm kind of a pragmatist. It's like, yes, I think the Gender Recognition Act should be reformed. I mean, arguably, I think that the whole question of whether or not we should have a legal gender is quite an interesting one. But ultimately, if you want a gender recognition certificate, I think it's useful to give people practical information that doesn't overwhelm them or make them feel like it's so difficult and so impossible. I mean, it isn't the easiest process, but it you know, very much is possible. So something like that, I would always say the GIRA's website has a very good guide, a very practical guide to like what you actually need to send off if that's what you want to apply for, and why a gender recognition certificate might be helpful. Yeah, in terms of other practical things, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, for example, I mean, I know one of the things that happens with a lack of practical advice sometimes is that people also get sort of scammed. Like, for example, with changing your deed poll. I'm lucky that I was a lawyer before I transitioned and before I moved into the third sector. You know, lots of people pay a lot of money to register a deed poll. When you don't, you really just need 2 witnesses. It's completely free, and then you should be able to take it to your bank or to the driving license authority, DVLA, or the passport office, and get your name changed pretty easily. But unfortunately, because there's a lack of good information. So it's just about being a little bit smart and checking the sources and double checking when you read what a process involves and what it costs, to maybe cross-reference that. That definitely helped me a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And I think at the Welsh Gender Service, we try to provide peer support to people waiting on the list, and some of those practical elements come through and they're asked quite often. So we make sure that people know how to get deed polls done and all the practical bits and pieces that they might want to do, particularly if they're thinking of changing a name and gender marker and things like that. Yeah. And of course, when you touched on the social justice and things that are actually important, materially important for trans people and communities, you know, this is actually something that I've now started to build into the teaching that I give to fellow health professionals. So I actually start now. I used to start, like you said, you know, talking about language and terminology and how you might start a conversation and what would be acceptable and not acceptable. And of course, that's all really important because there's so little information about how to consult in an affirmative way as a health professional. But I think yes, it's important to have comfort around language and identities, but actually I now foreground any teaching that I give with a potted history of healthcare in the UK, but also about social justice. So I talk about Stephen Whittle, Christine Burns, and you know, how rights were won and how rights are being potentially risked, and what they mean and what they are, and what they can and can't do, and what they do and don't offer. Because I think health professionals need to have an awareness of the broader context of people's lives in which they're living, and you know, social capital, this idea of having links to friendship circles, chosen family, you know, is so important for everybody. And it's about building up that social capital in order to thrive in society and not feel that you're doing it on your own. And I think that brings me quite neatly to the second question that I wanted to ask. You did a brilliant podcast with Owen Jones in collaboration with Freddie McConnell, and Owen asked you to share a little bit about your own journey through that sort of early social transition. And you'd said that you were informed by seeing different types of people and the way they interpreted gender, which I think is really, really interesting, because of course there's less gender conformity out in society, and people are seemingly more free to express their gender and name it and put a label on it and own that space. And so I'd love it if you just give us some top tips for people who might be watching, who are a little bit further back in their transition process. Perhaps they're at the start, they might have made a referral for gender services and they're in this waiting list space, and perhaps they're trying to work out how do they get themselves out of the house, how do they do me out in the real world, because I'm sure that was something that you had to work out back then, and whether or not you would tell your younger self some things now, and whether you'd like to share that with me.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, because I'd come out as gay initially when I was very much younger, I kind of was already in the queer space. But it's a very different thing to come out as trans. I would always say, even you know, whether what your starting point is before coming out as trans is a different kettle of fish. What I always say, a metaphor I always use, and I recognize how difficult it is that sometimes actually, and I try to use this to explain to cis people, non-trans people all the time, is that coming out, particularly as trans, is not the end point. It's often actually the beginning of a whole new host of problems. It might be that it's taken years to get there, but what I say is it's kind of like if pre coming out, before you work out, you know, maybe what your identity is or that you're trans or whatever, is it's kind of like being like on a raft adrift at sea, and you're sort of like there completely alone in the middle of the ocean, and that's quite terrifying. You don't really know if you're going to survive. But then sort of coming out is like seeing an island, but you're still nowhere near the island, and you don't know if anyone's on the island, and you maybe have like one flare and you're not sure anyone's going to see you. And in some ways that could be more anxiety inducing, because you can almost see potential salvation, but it's not there. And that can be with the waiting list for healthcare, or that can be, yeah, that can be the fact that you might have a certain idea about what you want, you know, if you want a medical transition, how you end up wanting to look like, how you end up wanting to present, but you're not there yet. That takes, you know, even the most classic medical cis-normative, what you want to call it, transition takes time if you transition as an adult. So it is difficult, and I think it's to acknowledge that it's difficult, and it's difficult, you know, I mean, gender non, you said about how I saw different ways of doing gender in society. It helped me a lot, because I realized that gender non-conformity, which is like when people see you on the street, you don't look like how people's idea of gender is, that will get you harassment, whether you're a trans person, whether you're a gay person, you know, that's difficult. And what helped me was, yeah, seeing there were different ways. You know, even though I ended up identifying as a trans woman in quite, I guess what people would say, a binary way, actually the people that helped me the most early in my transition were non-binary people, because they challenged my ideas of kind of what gender is. And, you know, even though I might call myself a woman, like what actually does that mean? And there are multiple ways to be trans, and actually, you know, there are different ways. There's no one way. I mean, I for example, I followed a couple of non-binary trans women who didn't do the classic thing of wearing wigs or dressing really feminine, and that really helped me too, because it was like, well, here's someone who's using she, her pronouns, calling themselves a woman, but actually is quite gender non-conforming, and that helped, because, you know, I couldn't look particularly feminine at that time. It was too early. So opening up your kind of ideas and being open to other people, other trans people's interpretations of gender is really important. The internet's really good for that. Social media is really good for that. But also like getting out to trans groups and making trans friends really early is really important. I'd say that's my biggest tip to someone who's just come out or is waiting. Is I know that there's a peer support service with the Welsh Gender Service, and that's really crucial. And getting to social groups, because there is no real replacement for being surrounded by people who are later in their transition, who normalize it for you. Because when you come out, when I came out, I thought I was the only trans person that ever existed ever, and I was the only person to ever transition. It's too monumental, which is also quite arrogant. It's you know, it can make you quite self-involved, but it also can be overwhelming. It's two sides. So it's good to have people in check to be like, you're not special, but also it's comforting to know you're not special, because it means other people have done it, and you will get to where you want to be eventually. And yeah, I think it's to acknowledge that, yeah, it's tough. I mean, people cannot speed up a waiting list. If we could, everyone would be. You can't speed up a physical transition. You can't speed up, you know, if you want to grow your hair long, or if, you know, you have to chest bind if you're transmasculine and you haven't had top surgery yet. You know, those things are difficult. And I think it's about having to embrace, I had to embrace patience, and recognize that things won't always be the same. They might not always be better, but they won't be the same as they are now. And yeah, and I think to have an expansive view of other trans people and how other people are doing gender, that can bring you comfort at that time. It might not be your ultimate final destination, but it's helpful to see other people that look like you at any stage, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing about reaching out and finding people who resonate with you and you resonate with is that they will also give you some practical tips and tricks about how to get what you need to get from the, you know, the administrative side of life.
Yeah.
As well, because the wealth of knowledge is there. It's just tapping into it, and often those are informal exchanges of information. But of course, you know, the online environment has another side, particularly the public one, and you are a trailblazer, and you elevate trans life and visibility, of course, brilliantly and with wit. And I think the fact that you're so sharp is probably what gets you through so much. But you also obviously attract unwanted attention too. And, and I don't know how you do it, frankly. You're so resilient, but it is such an important thing to be a role model for others. And that obviously sometimes comes at a cost at the moment. And I just wondered about, you know, how you might, whether you give some advice about people navigating online, as well as outside, but navigating online as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is is what you said is very kind, but I mean, I've made huge mistakes as well in that respect, and I forgive myself for them as well, because it's such an unprecedented thing. We've only had this kind of social media, you know, Twitter, etc., for the last decade. I came out 2014, 2015, so kind of halfway through that decade we've had it, and it's become a very trans people have become this huge target in a very quick space of time, and just in the same time. So, you know, I forgive myself for it, because I couldn't have anticipated, but I've made mistakes, so I'm happy to share so other people don't do it. And I think the key things I would think is that one is, like I said a minute ago, about a little bit about being not arrogant, but like slightly self-involved when you can come out when you think you're the only person ever. Is that in my case as well, another thing that can happen when you've just come out is that you've got sometimes a lot of pent up anger with, you know, for years you've been trying to say this to people, you've been trying to work out your identity, and you were told no, or you were told no, you can't do this or whatever, and then you finally get there. It can cause up a lot of pent up anger at society and perhaps people failing you. And sometimes the temptation is to be like, well, now I can go on a crusade and I can make things better for other people, which is fine, and I did that, but yeah, you have to think about self-care, and you have to think about what's the smart way to do that. And sometimes online trolling is there to distract you. That is their intention. They are there to wear you out. These people aren't actually affected by trans people at all, except in their own heads sometimes, but they're not, you know, it's your energy they'll take away. And I wish I'd known that, and I would have told myself that a few years ago. So as difficult as it is, and as tempting as it is with people who are, you know, often challenging your existence, seem to be bringing up a lot of things that you might have a lot of past trauma or whatever about, is to not rise to it. You give them power when you engage with them, as hard as it is, and wanting to stand up for yourself. You can stand up for yourself in real life, but the internet's got its own dynamics, and often it's just better to block and move on. That's really that would be the key message I would say to anyone, because I used to not, and I used to get into sometimes very serious intellectual arguments with these people, and then I'd realize, no, this is a bigot, you can't change their mind. And sometimes you realize it was bad faith, and they were just there to try and entrap you into an argument where you lose your temper or whatever. The other thing is to think about, if you do want to move in the online space, is to recognize, block and move on, and to recognize too that that you have to, you know, closed groups are really great, but trans people have this difficult thing where, especially on think networks like Twitter, where it's very easy to share lots of personal information because you're talking to your friends or your pals online who are also other trans people. That's fine, but don't put anything on in a public forum that you don't if you think it could be stolen, that information or that personal detail about you, or your pre-transition photograph or whatever, if you think that could be stolen and end up on a blog somewhere, don't put it online, send it to someone in a private forum. And then in terms of resilience, I think it's just really important to, that's why I say about making sure you have trans people offline as well, and other friends, cis friends, allies, etc., is that the online space is particularly toxic at times. It can be very easy to sit and think everyone hates trans people, everyone doesn't want trans women in women's toilets, because you see a disproportionate volume of hate online. But the reality is that most people don't care, full stop, and a lot of people actually do want trans people included. So it's useful to balance that out and make sure you don't spend so much time online that you actually think online is all there is to real life, because there isn't. And I think, again, there's been times where it's very easy to do that early in your transition too, because sometimes you literally don't want to go outside, and it's easier to spend a lot of time talking to people that you like on the internet, but also getting caught up in arguments, getting caught up in obsessively reading negative things. It's just not good for your mental health. So to really robustly protect your mental health is how I've managed to stay resilient after many years practice.
Yeah, I think the last thing that you said there is so important, that you get down a rabbit hole and you think that this is the whole world and this is the world view and that everybody's like that. And then the moment you step foot outside, and I'm reflecting stories that I've heard, not mine, but others who've told me, you're constantly looking over your shoulder, or, you know, suddenly terrified of using a public space or a public toilet, you know, sex segregated toilets or whatever, because you've read so much and you've just decided that this is the world and this is how it is. And in fact, like you said, you'll be pleasantly surprised if you know, most of the time actually people just have absolutely no interest in you or what's going on, and you're there to buy a cup of tea and have a piece of cake like the rest of the world. And I think I try to reassure people as much as I can, with my own experience of the trans allyship that's come from cisgender people, and across the straight and LGBT community, for, you know, as a response to the transphobia. There's also not just people who just quietly couldn't care less, but also people who do care in the opposite direction as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. I think it's the vast majority of people probably don't care, so long as you're not harming them. And then there are lots of, particularly in the LGBT community. I mean, this is one of the classic distortions online, is that, I mean, you'd almost think if you went online and read some, you know, if you spent too long reading transphobic things, that almost every cisgender lesbian has a problem with trans people. And actually, you know, as you said, I worked at Stonewall for years. That was, you know, 2 lesbian CEOs in Stonewall Cymru for many years. You know, 2 of the women I work with really closely were cis lesbians. I've had cis lesbian friends my whole life. I mean, you have to sometimes take a breath and be like, no, this isn't real. This is one group of people, very small minority, who've really created this myth that there's this huge rift that actually is, you know, a lot in real life isn't the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And the L with a T campaign was really, really huge, and it continues. So yes, take heart, but take care online, I think, is the thing. And don't forget to go outside and be part of wider society, because that is the society that we're in. And it's so important to be out and be proud and be visible. And, you know, if you need to take a chum with you, do it. I think that's a really good piece of advice. Have real life friends. You can call up and go, hey, I want to go this place, let's go, and do it. And get out there. Great, thank you. Thanks for that, it's awesome. I guess one of the things that I was really keen to talk to you about is your podcast series called Call Me Mother. It's brilliant, and I think this was probably one of your first podcast series that you've made, and I think you've done a really good job, in part because of the people that you've spoken to. They are 8 remarkable people who obviously shared key parts of their own lives and experiences. This is on queer history, and you know, and I think it really reinforces where we've come from and where we've got to. And I don't think you can be a queer person in Britain without really checking back to see who your ancestors are. And because it's so integral to that, like I think you described it, that collective sense of belonging and of knowing where we come from. And I just wondered, obviously you talk to these brilliant people, and I'm really curious to know what wisdom you extracted from that interaction. And what inspired you about those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think because one of the reasons that the series was commissioned was because of the pandemic we've been obviously living through for the last year and over a year now, and the fact that particularly for LGBT people, it's hit some LGBT people quite hard, particularly younger people who may have had to lock down. You know, I know personally of people who went away to university, classic time to start exploring your identity, and then they had to, you know, they decided to move home, and so they just started to explore, and then they've moved back home into perhaps hostile environment, or at least an environment where no one knows and they don't really want to have that conversation yet. And that can be very isolating. So I think the reason it probably resonated with people is that it's like, well, here's something you can listen to that connects you. And also what helped there was that these people, all of whom over 50, most of whom over 60 actually, who had been out as LGBT, various identities, since they were young. Really, that, there is, even though that people might be going through something quite difficult right now, and the pandemic is very unprecedented, is that actually that there's always a precedent. There's always someone that's probably experienced something not the same but similar. The AIDS crisis of the 80s was a huge, really, I think it's hard for people our age to kind of grasp about people who maybe moved, found their community, and then the AIDS crisis hit, and suddenly that community, the new community family they just found, was blighted by death, by loss, by fear. But the people who are still around, and there are plenty of people from that time still around, they found ways to not just survive it, but also, it wasn't completely miserable. People still had fun, still people went on nights out, people still had sex, people still went clubbing, and I think it's really important to, that's what came across to me, was about ways people found joy, even when we might think of it as a bleaker time, the past, to have been LGBT. And yeah, history surprises you. So one of the interviews, Sandra Caldwell, a Black trans actress, she's in her late 60s, and she came out and transitioned when she was, I think under 20, and her mother supported her. And you just think no one at that time had supportive parents. And again, there's a precedent. She wasn't a child, she was a young adult. But all the stuff about trans kids at the moment, so actually there have been young people being supported by their families in a social transition for decades, or much longer than we think. It's not a new thing. And I think that's really helpful too. And to also see a trans woman of color who is very happy, comfortable, alive, having a nice life, married, in her late 60s, is also really positive too, because what we often hear are misery stories. And of course, it's really important to remember people who have been taken too early or lost their lives. But it's also really important, I think, to see people who are in their kind of golden years or twilight years, whatever you want to call it. Golden years, not twilight, they're not always dead. Who are still having nice, enriched lives.
Yeah, definitely, because the narrative can feel so negative sometimes, and the possibilities seem so limited, but of course they're not at all. There's so much about the paper tigers, that I like to call it, the things that you fear but that aren't real. They're just made of paper and they're just confetti, and it's about smashing through that and just listening to these incredible stories. And of course you're right, if we don't, as this generation, I think, well, I'm quite a lot older than you, but let's go with that. Back when there were legal rights were different, and situations were very, very different then, even in Britain, right? And it's important to remember that, and know that queer people flourished and survived and thrived, and why shouldn't we, and why shouldn't the people watching this? And,
exactly.
And to just get out there and do it, and not be too bogged down by the fear that might not be actually real. So yeah, I think it's brilliant, and I'd urge anyone watching this to go look it up and have a listen, because they're 30 minutes of just complete bliss, each little nugget. So thank you. And Shon, I want to just finally, thanks so much for this. I could talk to you all day, but I won't. But was there anything that you felt that I maybe didn't cover, that you felt, you've got an audience of people who are, for the most part, waiting for health services. And of course, you're right. I don't want, and nobody wants, lives to go on pause. And that really important thing that you said about learning about patience, and your body might not be where you want it to be yet. And there's so much you can do to live and embrace you and figure yourself out. But I don't know, was there anything else that you felt that you wanted to share with anyone watching today?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? So a summary one. I think, I said about patience, and I think I sort of alluded to it earlier, but it's that idea that I think for a long time people were very keen to push messages about, oh, don't worry, it'll get better, it gets better all the time. But I don't think that, that doesn't always have to be the case. It's just things will change. That's the difficulty when you feel trapped and you feel stuck. the things that have helped me in really dark times, actually, both in transition and otherwise, mental health wise, is that actually, you know, this, you won't always feel the way you do now. You might not feel better, but you might feel different. You can't guarantee it'll be better. There will be times where you feel better, I'm sure, but you will feel different. And I think when you're waiting for healthcare services in particular, but when you're often, you know, feeling like I'm impatient, you know, this idea that it's very easy to think, I've lost too many years to the wrong gender, to the wrong life, whatever, and I don't want to lose any more time. I've got to make up for lost time. But actually, there is plenty of time. You know, you can, you know, it can feel achingly slow when it is, but it really won't be forever. So I think it's just to restate that, really.
Yeah, really, really wise words, and I hope it sinks in, because you're absolutely right. There is so much life out there to be grabbing hold of. So thank you, Shon, for your time and your energy, as always.
Thanks.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.